Some stories are about a reckoning that arrives with a bang. A door kicked in, a dramatic confession, a final bloody confrontation. But some of the most profound acts of revenge, they happen in silence. They happen on a chalkboard. The moment the key equation was written, a gasp echoed through the grand hall in Geneva. But this wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a battle for a man's soul, fought with mathematics instead of fists. I'm Serena, and on Revenge Pains today, we're diving into a story set at the height of the Cold War, where one brilliant physicist had to lose everything simply to prove the truth. This is a story about patience, about the unyielding power of intellectual integrity, and how one man, armed with nothing but his own mind, brought down a titan of the Soviet machine. This is the story of the Geneva Axiom. Our story begins not in the tense West, but deep within the heart of the Soviet Union, in a place that didn't exist on any map. Arzama's 16, a secret city hidden away in the forests populated by the nation's brightest minds. It was a city dedicated to a single, terrifying purpose, splitting the atom. But for Dr. Dmitry Volkov, it was simply home. It was a world of stark, functional buildings, of birch trees dusted with snow, and the constant, invigorating hum of intellectual discovery. Here, in this prestigious cage, Dmitry was a star. At 35, he possessed a mind that moved with a startling, almost lyrical grace through the most complex realms of theoretical physics. His colleagues, men twice his age, spoke of him with a mixture of awe and bafflement. They saw the chalkboard in his office, covered in what looked like an arcane script, and they knew they were in the presence of a mind that saw the universe in a different language. Despite the barbed wire and the armed guards at the perimeter, life for Dmitry was good. He was a true believer, a child of the revolution who saw his work not just as a scientific pursuit, but as a patriotic duty. He believed he was building a stronger, safer future for the Union. His world was his lab, his books, and the man he considered a second father, academician Ivan Morozov. Morozov was the director of the institute, a man whose portrait hung in the main hall. He was broad, with a kind face that was starting to soften with age, and a voice that could command a room or soothe a rattled junior scientist with equal ease. He had taken a young, brilliant Dmitry under his wing years ago, guiding him, championing his work, and celebrating his successes as if they were his own. Their weekly meetings were a ritual. They'd sit in Morozov's vast, wood-paneled office, a samovar bubbling gently on the side table, and talk for hours. "It's elegant, Dmitry," Morozov said one crisp autumn afternoon, looking over a sheaf of Dmitry's latest equations. "Truly elegant. This particle decay model, it's unorthodox. It challenges the existing framework." He tapped a thick finger on a specific line of chalky symbols. "Here, this assumption about asymmetry, it's audacious. The committee will fight you on it." Dmitry felt a familiar surge of warmth. "They always do, Ivan Petrovich, but the math holds. It explains the discrepancies in the latest accelerator data. It has to be this way." Morozov leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. He smiled, a fatherly, crinkling smile that reached his eyes. "And that is why you will change the world, my boy, and I will be content to have held the door open for you. This work, this is your legacy. This is what they will call the Volkov postulate one day." Dmitry's chest swelled with pride. He saw no reason to doubt the man's sincerity. Morozov's own work was solid, respectable, but it lacked the spark of true genius. Dmitry, in his political naivety, saw this as the reason for Morozov's generosity. The man was content in his role as a kingmaker, a facilitator of greatness. To Dmitry, the pure, unassailable logic of science was a shield. He believed that truth, once discovered, was its own defense. He couldn't imagine that in the corridors of power, truth was merely a currency, to be traded, manipulated, or, if necessary, stolen. He poured his life into his work, driven by the thrill of discovery and the encouragement of his mentor. The final pieces of his grand theory were falling into place, a beautiful, symmetrical structure that promised to redefine particle physics. He was on the cusp of his life's great achievement, and he felt nothing but gratitude for the man who had made it all possible. He had no inkling that the fatherly hand on his shoulder was already measuring him for a shroud. The call came on a Tuesday. a sterile, bureaucratic summons to Director Morozov's office for an unscheduled meeting. Dmitri felt a flicker of annoyance. He was on the verge of a breakthrough, the final verification of his core axiom. But a summons from Morozov was not to be ignored. He walked through the familiar, hushed hallways of the institute, nodding to colleagues, his mind still buzzing with equations. He expected the usual warm welcome, the bubbling samovar, the comfortable chair. Instead, he found Morozov standing stiffly behind his desk, and two other men in the room. They wore ill-fitting gray suits, not the lab coats of scientists, and they had the flat, watchful eyes of men who were paid to be invisible. KGB. The air in the room was cold, stripped of its usual collegial warmth. The samovar was silent. "Dmitri Antonovich," Morozov said, his voice clipped, formal. He did not use his usual affectionate tone. "Thank you for coming. These comrades have some questions for you." One of the men stepped forward, his movements economical and precise. He held a thin file. "Dr. Volkov," he began, without introduction, "we have reason to believe you have been engaging in unauthorized contact with foreign agents." The accusation was so absurd, so utterly disconnected from Dmitri's reality that he almost laughed. "What? That's preposterous. My entire life is within the perimeter of this city. Who would I even speak to?" The man opened the file. He laid out several black-and-white photographs on the polished surface of Morozov's desk. They were grainy, taken from a distance. They showed Dmitri talking to a visiting physicist from East Germany a few months prior, a perfectly sanctioned and monitored exchange. They showed him receiving a package of academic journals from an international courier, a standard practice. "This is ridiculous," Dmitri said, his voice rising. "This is my work. These are professional colleagues." "We believe otherwise," the man said calmly. "We have evidence that you have been preparing to sell state secrets to the West. Specifically," he paused, letting the word hang in the air, "your research on subatomic particle decay." Dmitri's head snapped towards Morozov. This was it. The moment the world tilted on its axis. He looked at his mentor, desperately searching for a sign, for the familiar, kind smile that would tell him this was all a terrible mistake. But Morozov wouldn't meet his eye. The director was staring down at his desk, his face a mask of grim resolve. "Ivan Petrovich, tell them," Dmitri pleaded, his voice cracking. "Tell them this is insane." Morozov finally looked up. His eyes were cold like chips of granite. "I can't do that, Dmitri." He picked up a thick, bound manuscript from his desk. It was Dmitri's work, his life's work, the culmination of 5 years of relentless effort. "I discovered your treason myself. When I reviewed your latest progress report, the military applications were staggering. It became clear that you were not developing this for the glory of the Soviet people. You were preparing it for sale to the highest bidder." He held up the manuscript. "For the good of the state, I have taken control of this research. It is too dangerous to be left in the hands of a traitor. I will continue it as a patriot." And there it was. The betrayal, so naked and brutal it stole the breath from his lungs. It wasn't just the accusation of treason. It was the theft. The calm, calculated appropriation of his very soul, presented as an act of patriotism. The men in gray suits were just functionaries. The architect of his destruction was standing right in front of him, holding his stolen legacy in his hands. The world Dmitri had known, a world built on the elegant certainty of logic and truth, had just been vaporized. All that was left was the sickening, acrid smoke of a lie. The days that followed were a blur of concrete and despair. Dmitri was confined to a small, featureless apartment, a guard at his door. The wheels of the state were turning, preparing the show. A sympathetic but ultimately powerless junior KGB officer was assigned to his case. He was a young man, barely older than Dmitri's students, with eyes that still showed flickers of a conscience. During one of their pro forma interviews, under the hum of a faulty light fixture, he deviated from the script. "They have everything, you know," the officer said, his voice a low murmur. "Signed confessions from 2 of your assistants. Financial records showing payments into a Swiss bank account you've never heard of. It's a perfect picture, a work of art." Dmitri sat on the edge of the cot, his hands dangling between his knees. He was hollowed out, the fight gone from him. It's all lies. Of course it is, the officer agreed with a shocking lack of guile. But truth is not the point. The narrative has been written. You will have a public trial. You will be found guilty. You will be a lesson to others. He paused, leaning forward. And then you will be executed. The finality of the word barely registered. Dmitri was already dead in a way. His name was being systematically erased, his work absorbed into the legacy of the man who had destroyed him. But, the officer continued, his voice dropping even lower, there is another option. It has been suggested, from a high level, that a traitor's escape would be just as useful as a traitor's execution, an embarrassment that proves the system's vigilance. Dmitri looked up. Escape. A door left unlocked, a guard looking the other way, a car waiting at the edge of the woods. You would defect. You would run to the West, confirming their narrative of the brilliant but morally corrupt scientist. You would be a disgrace. Your family would carry the stain of your treason forever. But, the officer held his gaze, you would be alive. Dmitri's immediate reaction was a surge of revulsion. Run, flee and let the lie stand. Let Morozov win completely and utterly. Abandon his family to shame and persecution. No, he said, the word a dry rasp. No, I won't do it. I will not sign their confession and I will not run. If they are going to kill me, they will do it while I am still telling them the truth. He couldn't accept it. It was a failure of his fundamental understanding of the world. Truth was supposed to matter. Integrity was supposed to be its own shield. To run would be to concede that everything he believed in was a childish fantasy. He would rather face a firing squad as Dmitry Volkov, the innocent physicist, than live as a nameless, disgraced phantom in the West. It was a refusal born not of bravery, but of sheer, stubborn idealism, the last remnant of the man he used to be. The young officer just sighed, collected his papers, and left Dmitri alone in the silence, to wait for a trial that would only have one possible outcome. The escape when it happened was not a choice. It was a shove. 2 nights later, Dmitri was woken not by a guard but by the sympathetic young KGB officer. He was out of uniform. Get dressed, he whispered urgently. Now, your choice has been made for you. Before Dmitri could protest, the officer pushed him towards the door. The hallway was empty. The path out of the building was clear. It was exactly as he had described. A door left unlocked, a guard looking the other way. The entire apparatus of the state was not offering him a choice. It was expelling him. He was being forcibly exiled, his refusal rendered meaningless. A black Volga was waiting, its engine humming softly in the frigid night air. The journey was a silent, terrifying blur through darkened forests and sleeping towns, ending at a deserted airfield where a small, unmarked prop plane sat waiting. A man in a heavy coat emerged from the shadows. He spoke Russian, but with a clipped, foreign accent. Dr. Volkov, I'm with friends, you come with us now. He was MI6. It was then Dmitri understood the full, horrifying scope of the game he was in. He wasn't just a pawn in Morozov's personal ambition. He was a piece in the great game between East and West. His defection was a prearranged transaction. He landed in London under a blanket of gray, drizzling sky that perfectly matched the state of his soul. He was taken to a nondescript safe house in Pimlico, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and stale tea. The next morning, he met his new reality in the form of a man named Arthur Finch. Finch was his opposite in every conceivable way. Where Dmitri was tall and angular, Finch was compact, rumpled, with a face that looked like it had been slept in. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better decades and smoked unfiltered cigarettes one after the other, filling the small room with a haze of blue smoke. He was Dmitri's designated handler. So, Finch began, after a long, evaluative silence, you're the genius, the one they were willing to trade that sub-commander for. He blew a plume of smoke towards the ceiling. Doesn't look like much. Dmitri, exhausted and disoriented, bristled. I am Dr. Dmitry Volkov. I am a physicist. I did not ask to be here. Finch gave a short, humorless laugh. No, you didn't. You just got caught on the wrong side of your boss's ambition. Happens all the time. Your lot, our lot, it's all the same. Men with egos stepping on men with brains. He took another drag from his cigarette. Look, Volkov, let's be clear. You are now a ward of Her Majesty's government. We own you. We pulled you out of the fire, and you will pay for that rescue with everything you know about Arzama's 16. Their processing capabilities, their personnel, their progress on the hydrogen bomb. Everything. You are not a guest. You are an asset. The words were brutal, stripping away any last vestige of agency Dmitri thought he might have had. He had escaped one prison only to be handed over to another, this one furnished with chintz armchairs and the illusion of freedom. Finch was not a mentor or a friend. He was a gatekeeper, a cynical, world-weary spymaster who saw Dmitri not as a man who had lost his life, but as a chest of secrets to be unlocked. Yet, through the cynicism, Dmitri sensed something else, a begrudging respect for the intellect Finch had only read about in files. Finch was a pragmatist, and a mind like Dmitri's, even broken and betrayed, was a powerful tool. Their relationship began not with trust, but with a cold, clear transaction. The British settled him in Cambridge. It was a landscape plucked from a storybook, a world of ancient stone colleges, manicured green lawns, and students on bicycles. It was meant to be a haven, a place for his mind to recover. For Dmitri, it was a technicolor nightmare. The sheer abundance was jarring, shops filled with goods, people laughing freely in pubs, the cacophony of individual choices. After the monochrome, monolithic world of Arzama's 16, where every life had a singular, state-mandated purpose, the freedom of the West was profoundly disorienting. It felt like chaos. He was given a small, sterile flat and a stipend. He was officially a visiting fellow with no teaching duties and no access to a lab. He was a ghost. His name, Dmitri Volkov, had been wiped from Soviet academic journals. In the West, he was a political curiosity, a defector, a potential spy. He was an object of suspicion to all. He would walk through the cobbled streets, past the famous Cavendish laboratory where masters had once unlocked the secrets of the atom, and feel a wave of nausea. He was a physicist who could not practice physics, a man whose entire identity had been wrapped up in his work, and that work had been stolen, his name filed off like a serial number on a gun. He was truly alone. His family, his wife, his young daughter were back in the Soviet Union, living with the shame of his treason. He couldn't contact them. They were lost to him, a phantom limb that ached with a pain he had to bury every morning just to be able to get out of bed. The suspicious eyes of Finch's underlings were a constant presence, a reminder that he wasn't free, merely repositioned on the chessboard. He had crossed the threshold not into a new life, but into a purgatory. He had lost his country, his family, his name, and the very work that gave his life meaning. All he had left was the burning, impotent rage of betrayal and the chilling realization that Ivan Morozov had not just ruined his life, he had successfully stolen it. Dmitri Volkov was dead. All that remained was this shell, wandering the impossibly beautiful streets of Cambridge, a man without a past, and it seemed without a future. The first year was a descent into a gray hell. Dmitri existed on a diet of weak tea, stale bread, and the poison of his own thoughts. Paranoia became his constant companion. Every stranger who looked at him for a second too long was a KGB agent. Every friendly academic who approached him was an MI6 plant trying to pry secrets from him. He slept in short, fitful bursts, waking up in a cold sweat. The image of Morozov's triumphant face burned into his mind. He spent his days in the university library, not reading, but just sitting, surrounded by the world of ideas he was now locked out of. His occasional meetings with Arthur Finch were a particular form of torture. Finch would push, relentlessly, for details about the Soviet nuclear program. The trigger mechanism, Dmitri, what kind of compression are they using? Finch would ask, lighting another cigarette. I was a theoretical physicist, Dmitri would reply, his voice flat. I worked on particle theory, not bomb design. Don't be coy, Finch would press. You were there, you heard things, you saw things. Give me something I can use. Dmitri gave him scraps, enough to keep them from deeming him useless and casting him aside completely, but his mind was a fortress. The secrets of Arzama's 16 were the last thing he truly owned, and he would not give them up to these cynical men who saw him as nothing more than a talking encyclopedia. Meanwhile, news from the world of physics trickled in, each piece another twist of the knife. Academician Ivan Morozov was being celebrated as a national hero. His groundbreaking paper, The Morozov postulate on asymmetric particle decay was published to international acclaim. He was on the cover of prestigious journals. He was giving lectures in Paris and Rome. Dmitri would read the abstracts, his hands shaking with a fury so profound it left him dizzy. It was his work. His words, his equations, his sleepless nights, all repackaged under the name of his betrayer. I want you to really put yourself in Dmitri's shoes for a moment. Stripped of your name, your life's work stolen, in a foreign country where everyone sees you as a potential spy. Can you imagine that level of isolation? The sheer, crushing weight of that injustice? Most people would break. They would succumb to bitterness, fade into obscurity, or give up entirely. And honestly, Dmitri came very close. But this is where the story takes a turn, because sometimes an ally appears where you least expect one. His salvation came not from the world of espionage, but from the world he thought he had lost forever. Dr. Eleanor Vance was a physicist at Cambridge, a woman who belonged to the new generation. She was brilliant, with a mind as sharp as a razor, and possessed a rebellious streak that made her a thorn in the side of the university's stuffy, conservative establishment. She wore trousers instead of skirts, challenged revered professors in open lectures, and had an almost religious belief that data, and data alone, was truth. She had read the Morozov postulate, and unlike the rest of the world, she wasn't entirely convinced. There was a leap in the logic, a jump between two of the core axioms that felt unearned. It was too neat, too perfect. The math worked, but it lacked the messy, beautiful struggle of genuine discovery. Intrigued, she sought out the mysterious, broken Soviet defector everyone whispered about. She found him in a dusty corner of the library, staring blankly at a page. She sat down opposite him, uninvited. "Dr. Volkov," she said, her voice clear and direct. "My name is Dr. Vance. I've read Morozov's paper. I think it's a fraud." Dmitri stared at her, his eyes hollow. He had been expecting this. A provocation, a test from Finch to see how he would react. He said nothing. Eleanor was undeterred. She pulled out a notebook and a pen. "His derivation for the lepton decay constant," she said, scribbling furiously. "It's elegant, I'll grant him that, but he doesn't show the intermediate steps. He just presents the final form as a given. Nobody gets there in one jump. He's hiding his work. Or," she looked up, her gaze piercing, "it's not his work to show." For the first time in a year, a flicker of something other than despair sparked in Dmitri's chest. He looked at the equation she had written. He looked at her intelligent, challenging face. She wasn't a spy. She was a physicist. She saw the flaw, the crack in the monolith of Morozov's lie, because she spoke the same language he did. The language of pure mathematics. Slowly, hesitantly, he picked up her pen. His hand trembled slightly, but he brought it to the paper. Next to her scribble, he wrote a single, complex line of derivation, the missing step, the true step, an ugly, convoluted, but logically sound bridge between the axioms. Eleanor stared at the equation. A slow smile spread across her face. "My God," she whispered. "That's it, isn't it? That's the real path. He just polished the beginning and the end and threw away the messy part in the middle." She looked at him, her eyes wide with dawning realization. "It's yours, the whole thing, it's your work." That was the beginning. Their alliance was forged not in a safe house, but over notebooks filled with frantic equations, in late-night sessions fueled by lukewarm coffee in Eleanor's cluttered office. For the first time, Dmitri began to talk. He didn't speak of his betrayal or his pain, but of his ideas. He poured out the fragmented, beautiful architecture of his theory, and Eleanor, with her sharp, incisive questions and her unwavering belief in his genius, helped him piece it back together. She wasn't just an ally. She was a whetstone, sharpening his mind, which had grown dull with disuse and grief. She argued with him, challenged him, and in doing so, she brought the physicist in him back to life. He was still a broken man, but for the first time since he'd landed in this gray, foreign country, he had a flicker of hope. He had a partner. And for a man with a mind like Dmitri's, a partner and a problem were the only weapons he needed. The plan began to form one rainy afternoon in Eleanor's office, the windows streaked with water, the room smelling of old books and wet coats. For months, they had worked in secret, a frantic, exhilarating period of intellectual reconstruction. On dozens of chalkboards, in hundreds of pages of notebooks, Dmitri, with Aliner as his brilliant sounding board, had painstakingly rebuilt his entire theory from memory. It was an agonizing process, like an artist forced to repaint his masterpiece from a faded photograph. But as the work took shape, so did Dmitri. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by the focused intensity of a predator. Aliner was scanning the latest issue of Physics World Asterisk, a journal that tracked major international conferences. Suddenly, she stopped, her finger tracing a line of text. "Dmitri," she said, her voice tight, "look at this." She turned the journal around. There, on the glossy page, was a photograph of a smiling Ivan Morozov. The headline read, "Geneva Symposium on Particle Physics, keynote address to be delivered by academician Ivan Morozov on his revolutionary new postulate." Geneva, neutral territory. A city of diplomacy and, more importantly, a city that was not under the direct control of either the KGB or MI6. It was an international stage, the largest gathering of the world's top physicists for the next 5 years. Morozov, puffed up with the arrogance of a thief who believes he has gotten away with the perfect crime, was willingly stepping into the lion's den. "This is it," Dmitri said, his voice quiet but vibrating with a newfound energy. "This is the place." He couldn't challenge Morozov through the press. No one would publish the ramblings of a disgraced Soviet defector against a celebrated national hero. He couldn't do it through espionage. Finch and his masters had no interest in scientific squabbles, only military secrets. But in Geneva, in that auditorium, before an audience of their peers, an audience that spoke their language of proofs and axioms, he could face him directly. "We can't just stand up and call him a liar," Aliner cautioned, her practical mind already racing ahead. "They'll think you're a madman. We need more than an accusation. We need proof. Undeniable, public, humiliating proof." "I know," Dmitri replied. A slow, cold smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile Aliner had ever seen on his face. "And I have it. I just have to get him to walk into the trap himself." He explained his idea, and Aliner's eyes widened as she grasped the sheer, elegant audacity of it. The plan was not to simply replicate his stolen work. The plan was to expose the thief by revealing a flaw so subtle, so deeply embedded in the original research, that only the true author could ever have known it was there. It was an intellectual time bomb. Their work shifted from reconstruction to weaponization. They spent weeks preparing. They created 2 presentations. The first was a perfect, polished version of Dmitri's original theory, the version Morozov had stolen, designed to be presented as a legitimate challenge. But the second was the kill shot. Dmitri worked relentlessly, his mind on fire. He was no longer just a victim. He was a strategist. He and Aliner were a team, poring over every line of the stolen research that Morozov had published, comparing it to Dmitri's own resurrected notes. They were preparing for an intellectual duel, meticulously crafting the questions, the rebuttals, the final, devastating reveal. This was their approach to the inmost cave, not a physical place, but a moment in time. That keynote address in Geneva. They were no longer refugees or rebels. They were hunters, and they were sharpening a blade made of pure logic. And for the first time, Dmitri understood what Arthur Finch, in his cynicism, could never grasp, that the greatest secret he possessed was not a schematic for a bomb, but the knowledge of how to dismantle one, piece by piece, in the full glare of the public stage. The grand amphitheater at the University of Geneva was packed. It was a cathedral of science, all polished wood and rising tiers of seats filled with the most famous minds in physics. The air buzzed with anticipation. On the stage, under the warm glow of the lights, academician Ivan Morozov stood at the pinnacle of his stolen glory. He was confident, expansive, his deep voice echoing through the hall as he presented the Morozov postulate. He moved through the equations with a practiced ease, but to Dmitri, watching from the 3rd row, he looked like a man reading a script in a language he didn't truly understand. Dmitri sat beside Aliner, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. Arthur Finch was 2 rows behind them, looking bored, having approved this academic exercise mostly out of a grudging curiosity and as a way to keep his temperamental asset occupied. MI6 had provided them with legitimate credentials and covertly swept their hotel room for bugs. But this part of the operation, the intellectual confrontation, was entirely on Dmitri and Alina. Okay, I need you to really picture this moment. The culmination of years of pain, of meticulous planning, all resting on the next 10 minutes. Morozov is basking in applause, looking like the king of physics, his face beaming with fraudulent genius. And then, a man everyone thought was a disgraced traitor, a ghost from a past best forgotten, walks towards the podium. My heart is pounding just thinking about it. Because what happens next? It's the kind of vindication you only read about in books. Morozov finished his presentation with a flourish, basking in the wave of thunderous applause. The moderator stepped up to the microphone. Thank you, Academician Morozov, for that truly revolutionary presentation. We have time for a few questions from the audience. This was the signal. Dmitri stood up. There was a murmur in the crowd as people recognized the infamous defector. He walked down the steps to the floor microphone, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his mind a sea of impossible calm. Academician Morozov, Dmitri's voice was steady, resonant, carrying through the hall's perfect acoustics. A fascinating presentation. So fascinating, in fact, that it mirrors work I myself was conducting before I left the Soviet Union. A collective gasp went through the audience. Morozov's smile froze on his face. He squinted into the crowd, his eyes widening in shock and fury as he recognized Dmitri. His KGB handlers, seated in the front row, stiffened. You, Morozov spat into the microphone, his composure cracking for a second before he regained control. A discredited dissident, you have no standing here. This is a scientific forum, not a political circus. I agree, Dmitri said smoothly. So let us dispense with politics and discuss the science. Your postulate is brilliant, but it rests on one particular axiom, the assumption of nonlinear symmetry breaking in kaon decay. It's a beautiful solution. A little too beautiful, perhaps. On the main screen, Dmitri, using a remote he and Alina had prepared, brought up one of Morozov's own slides, a core equation from the presentation. If this axiom is correct, Dmitri continued, it should hold true even under extreme energy conditions. For example, if we were to factor in the hypothetical effects of a contained high-frequency gravitational wave, a purely theoretical stress test, of course. Morozov paled. He had no idea what Dmitri was talking about. He had stolen the car, but he had never learned how to build the engine. He didn't understand the deep mechanics of the theory, only the polished surface. That is an irrelevant hypothetical, he stammered. The theory deals with observed phenomena. But theory must predict, not just describe, Dmitri countered, his voice like steel. He clicked the remote again. A new equation appeared on the screen, a terrifyingly complex piece of mathematics that he and Alina had built. This is the formula that models that stress test. Can you tell us, academician, what the result of this would be? Because if your axiom is truly sound, the result should be zero. If you could just walk us through the derivation. Silence. Morozov stared at the equation on the screen as if it were a cobra poised to strike. He was completely, utterly lost. The audience, a jury of his peers, watched, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. They could all see it. The emperor had no clothes. Dmitri let the silence stretch for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in that massive hall. Then, he delivered the final, devastating blow. Allow me, he said. He walked up onto the stage, took the chalk from the tray, and turned to a blank section of the board. You see, I put that axiom there for a reason. I knew it was flawed. He began to write, his hand moving with fluid certainty. I built a trap into my own work, a Trojan horse. I suspected that the purity of science was not always valued by the men in charge. As he spoke, he wrote a chain of derivations, each one logically flowing a devastating, beautiful proof. The axiom only appears to work. It's an elegant fraud. It holds under all standard models, but it collapses under this one specific, theoretical condition. A condition only the true author of the work would have thought to test for, because only the true author would know it was necessary to hide his signature deep inside the heart of the math. He finished the last line of the equation and underlined it. The result wasn't zero. It was one. A fatal, undeniable error. The entire postulate, the foundation of Morozov's fame, was built on a deliberate, hidden flaw. Dmitri put the chalk down. The sound echoed in the dead, silent hall. "The work is mine," he said simply, looking not at Morozov, but at the stunned faces of the world's greatest physicists. "And he is a thief." The silence was broken by a single person, a Nobel laureate from France, who began to clap. Slowly, then all at once, the auditorium erupted, not in the polite applause Morozov had received, but in a thunderous, roaring ovation for the ghost who had just reclaimed his soul. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The intellectual duel was over, but the physical one was just beginning. As the scientific community swarmed Dmitri, buzzing with excitement and 1,000 questions, Ivan Morozov was a portrait of apoplectic rage. His face was blotchy and purple, his grand triumph turned to dust in a matter of minutes. He wasn't just a fraud, he was a fool, exposed for his intellectual laziness in front of the entire world. He gave a curt, venomous order to his KGB handlers, and the atmosphere in the hall shifted from academic excitement to palpable menace. The scientists, sensing the sudden danger, instinctively backed away, creating a clear space around Dmitri and Alina. The thrill of intellectual victory was instantly replaced by the cold fear of political reality. "We have to go. Now," Alina said, grabbing Dmitri's arm. Arthur Finch materialized at their side, his earlier boredom completely gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "This way," he commanded, his voice low but firm. "The Swiss police will hold them for a while with diplomatic nonsense, but not for long. Morozov just lit a fire that could start an international incident." Finch led them not through the main entrance, but through a side door and into a service corridor. The sounds of shouting and arguing from the amphitheater faded behind them. They moved quickly through a labyrinth of back passages, emerging into a quiet side street where a nondescript black sedan was waiting, its engine running. "Get in," Finch ordered. "They'll have the airport and the train station covered within the hour." The car sped through the clean, orderly streets of Geneva, but the feeling inside was anything but orderly. It was a tense, claustrophobic silence. Dmitri looked out the window, the successful reward of his confrontation, the recapturing of his intellectual honor, already feeling like a distant memory. He had won the battle of minds, but Morozov was now using the brutish weapons of the state. He'd seized the sword of his honor, but now the enemy was coming with actual guns. Their escape route was a tense, nerve-wracking journey. They didn't head for the border. Instead, they drove high into the Alps, to a small, private airfield used by wealthy skiers. Finch was on the radio constantly, speaking in clipped codes. It was clear that MI6 had anticipated this possibility, a contingency plan for a hostile extraction. An enraged Morozov was a predictable complication. As they waited in a cold hangar, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. A second car, filled with Finch's men, stood guard at the entrance to the airfield. The road back to safety was proving to be just as perilous as the approach. Finally, a small Learjet with no markings descended from the gray sky, landing smoothly on the short runway. "That's our ride," Finch said, stubbing out his cigarette on the hangar floor. "Let's move." As they ran across the tarmac, 2 black Volgas appeared at the airfield gate, screeching to a halt. The KGB had found them. Finch's men opened fire, not to kill, but to delay, creating a cacophony of shouting and gunfire that echoed through the mountain valley. Dmitri and Alina scrambled up the steps of the jet, Finch right behind them, pushing them in. The door was sealed, the engines screamed, and the plane accelerated down the runway with a force that pinned them to their seats. As they lifted off, Dmitri looked down and saw the tiny figures and the black cars below, a foiled abduction on Swiss soil. He had escaped again, but this time he wasn't fleeing as a disgraced victim. He was being extracted as a triumphant, albeit incredibly dangerous, asset. The road back was a retreat, but it was a victorious one. He had faced his dragon and walked out of the fire, his reputation not just restored, but forged anew in the crucible of public confrontation. Back in the relative safety of the United Kingdom, the diplomatic fallout was immediate and intense. The Soviets officially protested the provocative abduction of a Soviet citizen, while the British flatly denied any involvement, their official statements a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. The scientific world, however, was on fire. The story of the Geneva Symposium was spreading like wildfire. Morozov, refusing all comment, had been recalled to Moscow in disgrace. Dmitri was in seclusion, protected at a secure MI6 facility in the English countryside. He had won, but the victory felt incomplete. He had proven Morozov was a thief, but he had not yet definitively proven the work was his. In the world of Cold War politics, doubt was a weapon the Soviets could still use. They could paint this as a complex MI6 plot, a fabrication designed to embarrass the Union. The final act of vindication, the resurrection of his name, came from a place Dmitri never expected, from deep within the walls of Arzama's 16 itself. A senior physicist, a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, had been a quiet admirer of Dmitri's. She had worked in a different department but had been aware of his genius, and like many, had been horrified and cowed into silence by his sudden downfall. Morozov's public humiliation in Geneva, however, had sparked a dormant courage in her. She knew Dmitri was telling the truth, and she had proof. Risking everything, Anya went into the Institute's deep archives. She found them, Dmitri's original notebooks. Pages and pages of his elegant, distinctive handwriting, his frantic scribbles, his crossed-out mistakes, his moments of sudden insight. And crucially, every single page was dated and initialed. They were an undeniable, chronological record of the theory's development, predating Morozov's discovery by years. This is the part that gets me every time. Because what she did next, most people wouldn't have the guts. It wasn't just about leaking documents. It was an act of profound intellectual and moral courage. It proves that even in the most oppressive systems, one person standing up for the truth can change everything. It's the difference between simple revenge and a true, lasting justice that cleanses the record for all to see. Anya knew she could never get the notebooks out. So, using a contraband camera the size of a matchbox, she painstakingly photographed every single page, creating several rolls of microfilm. Then, using a trusted contact in the diplomatic corps, she managed to smuggle the microfilm out of the country in a diplomatic pouch, an untouchable vessel heading to the Soviet embassy in Helsinki. From there, another contact passed it to a British agent. Weeks later, a stunned Arthur Finch walked into the room where Dmitri was being kept. He held a small canister in his hand. "Christmas came early, Volkov," he said, a rare hint of genuine excitement in his voice. He explained what Anya had done. That evening, copies of Dmitri's notebooks, alongside the story of their origin, were leaked to every major newspaper in the West. The Times of London, Le Monde, the New York Times, they all ran the story on their front pages. The evidence was irrefutable. The photographs of Dmitri's dated, handwritten notes next to the polished, published text of the Morozov postulate told a story more powerful than any political rhetoric. Faced with overwhelming global embarrassment and the mockery of the international scientific community, the Kremlin did the only thing it could. They cut their losses. A short, terse statement was released by the official state news agency, TASS. It announced that following an internal investigation, academician Ivan Morozov had been found guilty of gross scientific misconduct and plagiarism. He was stripped of all his titles and honors and had been reassigned to a non-scientific administrative post in Siberia. The Soviet Union, in a masterful act of political jujitsu, co-opted the narrative. They had purged their own ranks of a corrupt scientist, reaffirming their commitment to ideological and scientific purity. Morozov was erased, and in doing so, they had no choice but to implicitly and publicly acknowledge the true authorship of the work. Dmitri Volkov's name was finally, officially, cleared. The world changed for Dmitri overnight. He was no longer a defector, an asset, or a victim. He was Dr. Dmitri Volkov, the celebrated author of the Volkov postulate. Cambridge University, which had kept him at arm's length, now offered him a full professorship, complete with a lab, a staff, and an almost unlimited budget. His resurrection was complete. One gray afternoon, Arthur Finch came to see him one last time. He found Dmitri not in his new, spacious office, but in a small, empty classroom, standing before a large, clean chalkboard. Finch didn't bother with pleasantries. He handed Dmitri a small, plain envelope. "A message," he said. Let's call it a mutual acquaintance in Helsinki. It was passed verbally. It has been authenticated." Dimitri's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed on it. "The family is no longer under state observation. They send their love." The breath left Dimitri's body in a rush. It was the elixir. The final, most precious piece of his old life returned to him. His family was safe. The shame had been lifted. Morozov's poison could no longer touch them. It was a release so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from his chest. "He's been sent to manage a hydroelectric dam project above the Arctic Circle," Finch said, lighting one last cigarette in Dimitri's presence. "He'll live out his days counting ice floes, a fitting end for a man of his limited imagination." He paused, looking at Dmitri, then at the clean chalkboard. "So, what will you do now?" Dmitri looked at the blank slate. It was not an emptiness to be feared, but a space of infinite possibility. It was his future. He had won. He had not just destroyed his enemy, he had rebuilt his own life. He had found new allies, a new home, and a new purpose. The revenge was complete, but it had transformed into something more profound: restoration. He picked up a piece of chalk. "I will continue my work," he said, his voice clear and steady. And he turned to the board and began to write. So there you have it. Dr. Dmitry Volkov got his justice. But more than that, he got his life back. That chalkboard wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of his reclaimed future. You know, when I first heard this story, I thought it was about revenge on a mentor. But the more I think about it, the more I realize it's about reclaiming your own narrative, about proving that no one can steal the truth from you permanently, not if you're willing to fight for it. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest vindication isn't seeing your enemy fall. It's having the freedom and peace to continue your own rise. What would you have done in his position? Let me know in the comments below, because this one really makes you think. I'm Serena, and if this story of intellectual triumph resonated with you, I hope you'll join us again here on Revenge Pains. Thanks for listening.